The 26th of June is Australia's National Fossil Day, a date chosen to help celebrate one of the most significant fossil discoveries not only in Australia, but in the world. During this video we will also show video from the caves made by Bone Room's visit to Wellington a year ago on a very wet day. Where possible, I will try and keep the audio from our tour guide Katie, who was fun and informative. Now, as we walked into the large complex to our first cave, we passed Mitchell's Cave, and this is the location where Australia's first fossil rush began. There is near this place a very large and beautiful cave. I've been into it. It is formed on the side of a hill among limestone. It extends about 1/4 of a mile into the earth at an angle of 45 degrees. It then terminates in a deep pond of water. The inside of the cave is beautifully formed, some parts of it being 50 feet in height and supported by pillars beautifully carved by nature. I have got some specimens from inside of it. This is how the explorer, Hamilton Hume, first described in 1828 a series of caves recently discovered northwest of Sydney, near Wellington, New South Wales. The caves were soon visited by an artist called Augustus Earle, who later painted images of men as they crawled into their dark depths to explore them. Later Earle returned to England and joined the HMS Beagle and sailed with none other than Charles Darwin. However, our story begins in 1830 when a local magistrate from Bathurst decided to visit and explore one of these caves. Weeks later, a letter was published in the Sydney Gazette explaining just what this man had discovered. To the editor of the Sydney Gazette, Sir, Sydney, 21st of May, 1830. I beg you allow me a spare corner of your paper to inform your readers that a discovery which will doubtlessly excite very considerable interest in the scientific world, both in Great Britain and on the continent of Europe, has just been made in the interior of this colony by that very respectable colonist and magistrate, George Rankin, Esquire, of Bathurst. The discovery I allude to is that of a great quantity of fossil bones in a cave near the penal colony of Wellington Valley and about 210 miles west from Sydney. The country in the neighbourhood of Wellington Valley is of limestone formations, and the limestone ridges are perforated by numerous subterranean caverns, branching off in every direction and forming chambers of the most grotesque and at the same time of the most imposing appearance. The remarkable feature in the physical conformation of that part of the territory is not peculiar, however, to the limestone ranges of Wellington Valley. Similar caves are met with in Scotland, in Yorkshire, and in other parts of Great Britain, on the continent of Europe, in North America, and in short, wherever limestone abounds. In a late excursion to Wellington Valley, Mr. Rankin visited and explored a remarkable cave about 2 miles from the settlement, the existence of which had been known for a considerable time. Immediately beyond the entrance, the cave in question expands into a lofty and spacious chamber, the roof of which is beautifully ornamented with stalactites, many of which, however, have unfortunately been broken off by scientific barbarians of the neighbouring settlement. On lowering himself down into this third chamber, into which no mortal man had ever entered before, Mr. R observed, to his very great surprise, a piece of bone lying on the floor of the cavern. It struck him at first that it might have belonged to some bushranger who had attempted to hide himself in the cave, and had subsequently died. But on a more minute examination, he discovered a vast number of other bones of various sizes and generally broken, some strewed on the floor of the cave, but the greater number embedded in a sort of reddish indurated clay along its sides. The rope by which he had lowered himself into the cavern had been fixed to what appeared a projecting point of solid rock, but on its breaking off, in consequence of the weight attached to it, it was ascertained to be a large fossil bone. The thigh bone I conceive of some quadruped much larger than the ox or buffalo, and probably of the Irish elk, the rhinoceros or elephant. Soon scientific journals across Europe carried this letter, often containing the following observation from Professor Robert Jameson about some of these fossils that eventually arrived from Australia and were made available to him for study. My friend and former pupil, Dr. Adam, Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, having after much labour cleared the teeth and bones from the stony and earthy matter in which they were enveloped, we endeavoured to determine the animals to which they belonged. The general result of our examination was that some of the teeth were those of the wombat, some belonged to the kangaroo, others we could not refer from want of means of comparison. One bone, from its great size, particularly arrested our attention from its appearing to belong to an animal larger than any living species in the Australian world. It appeared, on comparing it with the splendid skeleton of the hippopotamus in the museum, to resemble the radial bone of that animal. Now, distance and time is a strange combination, especially in the early 19th century, and reading all the above notes, it's easy to think that it was Rankin whose finds had so caught the imagination of European scientists. This is simply not the case. Rankin had much earlier left the caves and soon returned, this time with Sir Thomas Livingstone Mitchell in tow. Now, Mitchell had made his name in the Duke of Wellington's army in Spain, fighting Napoleon. Here the Quartermaster General's department had used his outstanding ability as a draftsman to move in front of the army and map the terrain before them. This ability led to his position as Surveyor General of New South Wales, and he began creating new roads, mapped and then laid out new parts of Sydney. This also explains why so many places in the state today carry names from the Napoleonic Wars. Mitchell's explorations into the interior of the colony would help open up great sections of the country, including many parts of Queensland and Victoria. Now, it was after this visit that Mitchell ensured the bones were retrieved and sent back to Sydney. In a very short time, several reports of the fossils these men found appeared across the globe. Both spent the summer excavating the Wellington Caves, where they found bones belonging to a number of different animals. Though many mirrored the living marsupials and large ratite birds they saw all about them, to their surprise they also unearthed a number of giant bones. In fact, an entirely new branch of prehistoric fauna had just been discovered. Now, the records indicate Mitchell sent 3 shipments of fossils from Wellington. The first he seems to have sent to Professor Jameson in Edinburgh, the second to Georges Cuvier in Paris, while the third arrived in London to Richard Owen. Tragically, it was the shipment to Paris that seems to have arrived too late, as they were never inspected by Cuvier, as he died just a few days before they appeared. However, his assistant, an Irishman called Joseph Barclay Pentland, inspected not only these, but those sent to Edinburgh. It was his findings that noted almost all of these fossils belong to animals that still can be found in Australia. However, not all of them. To quote, Mr. Pentland remarks, in regards to these bones, that of these 9 animals, only 2 species of kangaroo do not differ in their anatomical characters from species inhabiting the same continent, whereas there is reason to suppose that the 7 remaining species differ from all those hitherto known to zoologists, and that some of them belong to extinct species. In London, Owen had also received his fossils from Mitchell, and they seem to have been far more complete than the previous collections sent to Cuvier and Jameson. Now, if there's one person who could be called the grandfather of modern paleontology, it's Sir Richard Owen. Not only did he coin the phrase dinosauria, but he was influential in naming and describing many of the world's prehistoric species. What most people don't know, however, is that the man had ties with Australian paleontology. At a time when some of our greatest discoveries in paleontology and zoology were being made, and at the head of this crest were a handful of scientists, and by far the most important of these was Sir Richard Owen, and possibly the least known outside of paleontology. The following is just a quick list of the most important things this man either discovered or helped name. As noted, in 1942 he created the name dinosaur for a distinct tribe of suborder of saurian reptiles. In 1863 he also described possibly the world's most famous fossil, Archaeopteryx lithographia, the world's oldest bird. He also gave the first scientific description of the gorilla. He helped name the giant prehistoric sloth called Megatherium from South America, and is also one of the first to help describe a nautilus. The one thing he's probably most famous for, however, is his stance against Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. Owen saw about him the hand of God, and he believed that all the similarities in these animals was proof of a divine mind. Where Owen is important to Australia is in the naming of many of our most famous prehistoric marsupials. Now, Australia at the time had its own scientists, who were working hard to discover and describe these animals, including Sir Thomas Mitchell, who collected specimens from all across Australia, including the Wellington Caves. Unfortunately, Sir Thomas's trustees told him to pack up his specimens and notes and send them to England for the honour of having our specimens properly described by English scientists. Owen was the man given the job, possibly because of his almost unnatural ability to describe an animal by looking at only a few remains. In 1858, Owen described Thylacileo carnifex, the Australian marsupial lion. Though he recognised similarities between it and other Australian herbivores, the huge shearing teeth were those of a carnivore. The size of these teeth and the power that must have been in that body had Owen describing it as the fellest of predatory beasts. His ideas were almost immediately dismissed, as many believed that as these animals were related to herbivores, that they were simply melon eaters. Today we know the truth, with recent studies having Thylacileo as the most powerfully jawed mammalian predator that ever lived. In 1872, Owen then described another giant flightless bird, which he dubbed Dromornis australis. This is possibly the largest bird that ever lived and is often dubbed the demon duck of doom. He also named the biggest marsupial ever, Diprotodon, the giant wombat, and many, many other species, most of which based on the fossils that came out of Wellington. Along with some fossils from South America that Charles Darwin had brought back, the fossils from Wellington were extremely important on several fronts. For one, they were used to help show that species died and changed. They showed that the animals in these regions were similar to their ancient, dead relatives, yet as they themselves were no longer to be found in the region, it suggested these remains were somehow related to their modern-day counterparts, but were not the same creature. This suggested evolution. In 1836, the beagle actually arrived in Sydney carrying Charles Darwin. During his time in the colony, he got a chance to see many of these actual fossils, but it wasn't until he returned to England that he read about the work Owen had been doing on them. It was now that this work and these fossils and their seemingly natural progression into modern Australian species helped Darwin reach his theory of evolution. And now for the good and bad news. Bad news? Sadly, a lot has been lost from these caves in the years since these initial discoveries, as many of these fossils were actually buried in deep deposits of phosphate, leading to a mine that would produce fertiliser for local farmers who were working with the continent's nutrient-poor soil. Unfortunately, this mine would destroy large numbers of these fossils. The caves were also frequently vandalised during the 19th century until 1884, when they were declared a natural reserve. By 1888, over 1,500 people a year were visiting them. As of 2005, over 50,000 people visit the caves annually. Now, it's two of these caves that are quite important and open to visitors by guided tour. The Cathedral Cave holds the stunning stalagmite in its main chamber known as the Altar Rock, which is 32 metres in circumference at its base and over 15 metres high. But here there are also fossils. When I visited the caves with a bunch of my fellow crew in the National Dinosaur Museum, there was a dig in one corner looking for marsupial fossils like the ones we've already described. But the caves themselves are made from limestone dating back to the Devonian. If you visit, ask the guide to point out the various fossils contained in this 400 million year old rock. There's at least one fish, a nautiloid shell, and a whole bunch of coral. But it's part of the phosphate mine complex, the Bone Cave, where you can see real treasures.
Was a little enthusiastic, but it's pretty close. All right, so welcome to Bone Cave. So, my goodness, I could do an hour's tour just in here with bones. But you can see the fragile nature and the compaction, and you can really imagine what's happened. So this would have been an opening to the surface, and you imagine real torrential rain, turbulent floods, just pouring mud and material into here. And of course all that survived is the mud, some stones, and the bones. And it's still, even with crystallization that's happened, pretty much from now on, anything that sparkles and is white as crystal. If it's got a definite shape, it does. Maybe it sparkles in its crystallized bone, but that's a rare thing, but it is in here. So you've got bones, and we are still looking out for non-sparkly white. So we've got phosphate at some point in this phosphate mine. It's pretty easy as well when you really start looking to identify limb bones in particular. You're really lucky you find jaw bones and teeth. So, you know, models are life-size. We mean megafauna, human-sized or bigger. Even just a quick comparison of some of the really obvious bones that you can see. You know, that's going to fit inside my arm or leg quite happily. So that's from a human-sized animal or bigger. To give you a better idea, excuse our presentation style, but picture hooks and frames are a little tricky. This poster is a really good representation, and specifically not just of some cool megafauna, but ones that we think survive the longest. So different dates now, they might even have survived right up to the last ice age. That was kind of the straw that broke the Diprotodon's back. Got real dry here, not so much icy. Now there's an odd picture on that poster of a dingo. Dingoes were not here a million years ago.
Just showing you the size.
It's a size comparison. So if you imagine how big a dingo is,
Hard hat on, you begin walking down the path into what is simply a treasure trove for any fossil fan. though it's the rooms where you can still see fossils in situ that are a wonder to behold. White in the red soil of the caves, these at times sparkle like jewels as the calcium carbonate crystals catch the light. In various places throughout the caves, they have also placed complete replicas of the most famous species found here, like Diprotodon and Thylaccoleo.
The Diprotodon to dispatch that prey. So that's one theory. These were meant to grip on and hang onto the back of a large kangaroo, large Diprotodon species. The other theory, of course, is that it might, like jaguars do today, climb trees for shade or to snatch prey from other competitors. The famous joke that's now going around, of course, is could have ambushed its prey from above, so you could have dropped there. I love having international visitors on my tour because we all get them going and go, no, it wasn't a koala, it was there. But that's the best joke we have.
And if you're lucky, you might get to do a session in the cave's new laboratory. Here you can search and even hold real fossils from the caves. I was lucky even enough to get to see a Thylaccoleo tooth. Now, I will do more about our visit to the caves later and show more fossils and more footage. But on this date, it's more about the celebration of Australia's National Fossil Day, which is, of course, the 26th of June, the date that Rankin and Mitchell brought out bones and reported them to a world that had never heard of such things as giant marsupials. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something, and I hope you head out to your local museum and see what other things they've got on show and maybe take some photos and share them with us at our Facebook page at Australia's National Fossil Day. Thanks.